Homeland is a book by R.A. Salvatore. R.A. Salvatore wrote an entire series called The Legend of Drizzt. It is a very popular, well-known series in the fantasy world, among people who play Dungeons & Dragons, among people who read fantasy books. The character Drizzt Do'Urden, who is the main character of this book, is very well known. This is the first in a series of 13 books, the first chronologically. It was not the first written. I'm not sure of the exact date, but sometime in the 80s, I believe, the author, R.A. Salvatore, wrote The Crystal Shard and went on to write a few more. The Crystal Shard was so successful and people loved this character so much in it that he began to write sequels to it. Drizzt actually wasn't even the main character of The Crystal Shard, and it just kept growing in popularity so much that he went on to write prequels, so 3 prequels that he ended up writing. This would be the first, chronologically, of the prequels, and they're now, they didn't used to be, but now in newer editions they're ordered by numbers of chronology, so this one is labeled as book number 1, and it is the first in the series. If you want to start the series, this is where to start. When I began reading the series 5 years ago, I just recently finished the 13th book about 4 months ago or so. When I first began reading the series, I'd heard about it before from other people, but I didn't know where to start at all. And that, I find that to be a trouble sometimes with certain series of books that I really want to get into, is the series are just gigantic, like very large book series, and if they're not always, some of them aren't always clearly labeled, or even if they are, they have like separate series, like this is book 1 of the second series kind of thing. But this is the book to start on. This one starts with the beginning life of Drizzt Do'Urden, the main character. It's the story of him being born and growing up. It explains how he became who he is, all that fun stuff. And that book is called Homeland, again, and it is the first. Just as a note, they won't all look like this. This is the most recently released edition. This is my favorite edition personally, and mine's a paperback because I'm too poor for hardback. But it's the first in this edition, so if you go out somewhere looking for it, you'll probably see this edition, other ones that look kind of like this book too, but they do come in other editions. Personally, I really like this edition just because of all the artwork on it. I really like the artwork done in all the books. I prefer it much more to the older editions that came out during the 80s, and I think a few might have come out during the 90s. I'm not entirely familiar with the history of releases for this book series, but normally I'm a little hesitant to make recommendations to people about books. I feel like everyone likes a different thing. It's like with movies, some people like action, some people like horror, and some people don't like certain kinds. Some people just do not like romance, some people just do not like comedy for some reason. And I feel like it's even pickier with books. For example, I don't like romance books myself. I'll still read one, but it's not my kind of thing unless it's highly recommended to me. But I can safely, without a doubt, say that I think just about anyone would really like this book and really like the series. But if you want to see if you like the series, it's a great place to start. It is a wonderful book, one of my favorites. The series is overall one of the best fantasy series ever. In fact, it's the best fantasy series that I have ever read personally. So I would rate this as the best fantasy series I know of. And this book is just wonderful. But I mean, if you like, if you've read Lord of the Rings, if you've seen the movies for Lord of the Rings and not read it, you would like this book. If you're familiar with Dragonlance books, you would like this book. If you've read any fantasy books at all and enjoyed them, you would like this book. This is a wonderful, wonderful fantasy book. And I'd even go as far as to say, if you don't like fantasy books, maybe this one can make you like fantasy books. It made me a big fan. I had liked them before, but it wasn't really something I was really heavily into. I usually read more of kind of like science fiction-y stuff. But after this series, it just really took off. I began going to bookstores just looking at new fantasy books to try out. And ever since, I really haven't found any that are as good as this one. The series, that is. Not that the book isn't bad itself. Negatives of the book, it's this one itself. It's a little difficult to start off as, especially if you don't know anything about fantasy. It's kind of difficult to understand at first. When I first got it, I didn't know if this was like the first one, because it was one of those things where you don't really know what's going on for a few chapters after the book starts. So that was a little bit confusing, but I mean, it might have just been because it was 5 years ago, and I wasn't as advanced a reader as I am now, so I really don't think that's much of a problem. Just something to keep in mind if you're brand new to the fantasy series. It might be a little confusing at first. But beyond that, I really just, I can't think of any flaws with it personally. I've heard other people tell me their opinions of this book, and I've honestly just never really heard anyone dislike it. I think it's that good of a book. It's a beautifully written book. The whole series itself is beautiful. It tells about this character, Drizzt. He's a dark elf, also known as a drow to some people who are aware of the term. If not dark elf, I'll say dark elf from now on. He is a dark elf. That's a evil race. They're like elves, but they have purplish, blackish skin. They live underground in a wide area called the Underdark. It's essentially just a gigantic series of caverns underneath the earth, so they all live underground in complete darkness. And the race of dark elves itself is considered evil. They're born evil. It's just the idea. And what happens is Drizzt is actually born good, or if you want to be very picky and you know what an alignment is, he's actually chaotic neutral, but for all intents and purposes, I'm just going to say he's good. So Drizzt is actually a good drow. He sees these evil things going on around him in his family and in his town, and something just feels wrong to him, and he grows up with this feeling of just, it's all wrong, and I want to do good things, but he has to try and seem like he's still evil to everyone around him, because, I mean, if they knew, they'd kill him. What good is a good drow? No one likes those things. So it's the first one, at least, is just a story about trying to fit in with all of them, and I don't want to ruin the ending, but it goes on. Well, I can't say anything because I'd ruin the ending, but it's a nice ending. They're all pretty much cliffhanger endings, though, because the series goes on for 13 books. And it's a very popular series, actually. The author after he finished these main 13 ones, he released 3 more books about Drizzt that follow up the end of the series. And then he released 3 more books about 2 of the side characters in this book. And then he wrote 3 more books just recently in the later half of the 2000s, also about Drizzt. I haven't gotten to those ones yet. I don't know what they're about personally, so I can't say anything about those at the moment. And he just a few months ago actually released another book about Drizzt. At least Drizzt is in it. I don't know if he's the main character. I haven't gotten to that one still. I have to finish up a few more in the Drizzt series before I can get there. But a problem I know of a lot of people having, and that's sort of why I wanted to make this review, is they'll hear about series and not know where to get in. This is the series, or the book in the series to start on. Not, because there are several different series of this series, I don't really know how to explain it. This one is called The Legend of Drizzt, Book 1. The Legend of Drizzt is where you want to start if you want to start reading about Drizzt. It is the first book about him growing up, and then it goes on. You might see other ones, like the Hunter's Blade trilogy, that follows these 13 books. There's another trilogy called the Sellswords that follows later, and then there's another trilogy called the Transitions, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago. And The Legend of Drizzt, I should say that in the top left corner, if you have the same edition as me, that's just the series, The Legend of Drizzt. It's where it all starts, his story, etc. I'm repeating myself now. Point is, this is where you start. Homeland, first book, should be purple if you have my edition. And, as I've said before, honestly, one of the best books I have ever read. It also kind of carries an undertone of, although I don't think this was entirely the author's purpose of writing it, but it seems to be more like a side theme of racism, or just judging in general, I suppose you could say, to make it a bit different. But because people perceive him later on, they say, oh, you're a dark elf, you're evil, all those things, when he's not. And they assume that just because they see him because of the color of his skin. So as a kind of underlying theme, it does talk a bit about racism and judging people. And it's very interesting, the character itself. I think this is one of the most well-developed characters I have ever read about. I can definitely say, character-wise, he is the best character I have ever seen written. A wonderful character. Series, not the best, definitely one of the best. In this book, I would probably say is one of the best of the series. I think all the first ones are some of the best. And then there are a few in the middle and a few at the end that become the best. It kind of goes up and down. Not that any of the series is bad, really. And I think that's what I like so much about the series, is that the entire series is good. I didn't dislike any of the series. There were times when I said, this isn't as good as the last book or the book before, but it was still a good book. And that's what I like so much about this, is it never got old. Never. And that's pretty much it. If I had to give this book a rating, I would give Homeland, the first in the series, a 9 out of 10. If I had to give the whole series itself a rating, I would probably give it a 10 out of 10. Best fantasy series I have ever read, and I'm willing to wager it will be the best fantasy series I will ever read, or at least remain to be one of the best. It is a wonderful series with wonderful characters. It is beautifully written. The fights are wonderful. The way he describes how the sword play between people, things like that. It's just wonderful, and the plot is great. Everything about it's good, as I've said many a time, yet again. So that's about it. 9 out of 10. I would definitely suggest going and purchasing this book, even if you're not into fantasy. They're not very expensive, actually. How much was mine? Mine was only $8, this series, paperback. I would say go pick it up, give it a read. If you get bored by the first few chapters, keep on going for a little bit. I think it might have started out a little boring, but it really picks up, and it's a very nice series. So definitely give this series a try if you're looking for a new fantasy book. But just be warned, you're going to read the first one, and then if you really like it, you're going to want to read all the 12 others, and that's going to take up a lot of time unless you're a really heavy reader. So it's kind of like an addiction, but great series. So that would be Homeland by Ari Salvatore. Thank you for watching.